This is Mr. Oscar, and today we will name something that I have never heard anyone in the productivity space say with the directness it deserves. Most of what you call being productive is not productive at all. It is safe. And those two things, productive and safe, are not the same thing. They feel the same from the inside. They look the same from the outside. They produce the same sense of forward motion, the same satisfying end-of-day fatigue, the same quiet conviction that you are someone who works hard and takes their goals seriously. But one of them is building something real, and the other is an extraordinarily sophisticated psychological defense mechanism dressed in the costume of achievement. I want to spend the next few minutes helping you see the difference, not to make you feel guilty about the hours you have spent performing safety while calling it productivity, but because the moment you can see it clearly, the moment you can catch yourself in the act, something shifts that no habit system or productivity framework has ever been able to shift from the outside. I need to describe a day from my rebuilding years that I am not particularly proud of. It was 2013. I had a single most important task sitting on my desk, a proposal that, if completed and submitted, had a genuine chance of landing the contract that would have meaningfully changed the trajectory of the new business. It was not a complicated task, 4 pages. I had done the thinking. I had the information. The actual writing, if I had simply sat down and done it, would have taken perhaps 3 hours of focused work. I did not write the proposal that day. What I did instead was this. I reorganized my entire filing system, physical and digital, something I had been meaning to do for months and which suddenly felt urgent at 8 a.m. on the morning the proposal was due. I responded to 11 emails, none of which required a response that day. I researched 3 competitors whose work was tangentially related to the proposal, producing 4 pages of notes I never looked at again. I rewrote my weekly plan. I cleaned my desk twice. I made a second pot of coffee I didn't finish. By 6 p.m., I was genuinely tired. I had been working, visibly, continuously, effortfully, for 10 hours. The proposal remained unwritten. And the most disturbing part, the part that I only understood years later when I found the research that explained it, was that I felt, at some level, that I had earned the right not to write the proposal that day, that I had put in the hours, that tomorrow I would be more ready. I was not being lazy. I was performing productivity as a mechanism for avoiding the one thing that actually carried risk. I was performing safety, and I had become so skilled at it that I could no longer tell the difference between the performance and the real thing. The psychological architecture underneath this behavior is documented across several bodies of research that together explain not just what is happening, but precisely why it is so difficult to catch in yourself. The first and most foundational explanation comes from the work of Stephen Pressfield, not a psychologist, but a writer whose book The War of Art articulated something about creative and professional resistance that the behavioral research has since confirmed from multiple directions. Pressfield identified what he calls resistance, with a capital R, as the force that consistently redirects human energy away from the most important, most meaningful, most identity-exposing work and toward anything that feels busy without being threatening. Pressfield's insight was that resistance is not random. It is not evenly distributed across all tasks. It is specifically and precisely strongest around the work that matters most, the work that carries real stakes, the work whose outcome will say something real about who you are and what you are capable of. And the behavioral research confirms this with precision. Dr. Piers Steele at the University of Calgary found in his procrastination research that task aversion, the psychological cost of approaching a specific task, is directly proportional to the perceived stakes of the task. The higher the stakes, the stronger the avoidance pull, which means the most important work you have to do today is also the work your nervous system is most motivated to redirect you away from. This is not weakness. This is the nervous system doing exactly what the previous conversation on this channel described, registering high-stakes work as psychological threat and activating the avoidance response that protects you from the discomfort of genuine exposure. The filing system reorganization is not irrational. It is the nervous system's elegant solution to an impossible-feeling problem. Give the person something to do that feels like progress without requiring them to submit to the judgment of real stakes. The second body of research I want to bring in comes from Dr. Adam Grant at the Wharton School, whose work on what he calls productive procrastination, the tendency to complete lower priority tasks as a mechanism for avoiding higher priority ones, found that this pattern is extraordinarily common among high-functioning, achievement-oriented people, and that it is particularly difficult to interrupt because it is genuinely productive in a narrow sense. The emails do need to be answered eventually. The filing system does benefit from organization. The competitor research does have some value. The safety performance is not useless work. It is real work, chosen specifically because it is real enough to feel legitimate and safe enough to not require genuine exposure. Grant's research found that the distinguishing factor between productive procrastination and genuine execution is not the quality of the work being done. It is the relationship between the work being done and the work that most needs doing. And that relationship, which should be the primary organizing principle of every working day, is almost never examined honestly by the people most prone to performing safety. The third explanation connects to the research of Dr. Shelley Duvall and Robert Wickland at the University of Texas, whose work on self-awareness theory found that humans have a deep and largely automatic tendency to reduce the discomfort of the gap between their actual self and their ideal self, the gap between who they are right now and who they believe they should be or could be. There are two ways to reduce that gap. The first is to move toward the ideal self, to take the actions that close the distance. The second is to stop looking at the gap, to redirect attention toward activity that feels purposeful enough to quiet the awareness of the distance without actually closing it. Safety performance is the second mechanism running at full capacity. Every hour spent on low-stakes productive activity is an hour in which the gap is rendered temporarily invisible. The busyness creates enough psychological noise to drown out the signal of the most important, unfinished thing. And Dr. Roy Baumeister's research on ego depletion, the finding that self-regulatory capacity is a finite resource that depletes with use, adds the final layer that makes this pattern so self-reinforcing. Every hour spent performing safety depletes the cognitive and emotional resources available for genuine high-stakes execution, so that by the time the important work can no longer be avoided, the person is genuinely less capable of doing it well than they would have been at the beginning of the day. The safety performance does not just delay the important work, it actively degrades the capacity for it. Here is the practical framework I want you to build from today. 3 components, each one addressing a different layer of the safety performance pattern. The first is what I call the daily exposure audit. It comes from the research of Cal Newport at Georgetown University, whose work on deep work identified what he calls the most important thing, the single task that, if completed today, would produce the most meaningful forward movement in your most important project or goal. Before you begin any working day, before you open email, before you check anything, before you do anything that could plausibly be described as productive, write one sentence that answers this question. What is the one thing I could do today that would produce real results and real exposure simultaneously? The word exposure is critical, because Newport's research shows that the tasks most people consistently avoid are not the hardest tasks in terms of cognitive demand. They are the tasks that carry the most genuine risk of being seen, judged, or found insufficient. The proposal, the phone call, the creative work that reflects your real capability, the decision that commits you to a direction. Write that task down before anything else and make a specific commitment using Gollwitzer's implementation intention structure about when it will happen and what you will do when the pull towards safer work appears. The second component is a safety performance interrupt, a specific pre-written question you ask yourself at 2 points during the working day, mid-morning and mid-afternoon, that cuts through the noise of busyness and forces an honest assessment. The question is this: is what I am doing right now the most important thing I could be doing? Or is it the most comfortable thing I can justify doing? Not as self-criticism, as honest navigation. The distinction between those two things, important versus comfortably justifiable, is the entire territory of safety performance, and most people go entire working days without asking it once. Baumeister's research on self-awareness shows that the simple act of periodic honest self-assessment, even without any other intervention, produces measurable improvements in the alignment between intention and behavior. The question itself is an intervention, but only if it is asked with genuine honesty rather than answered reflexively with a defense of whatever you are currently doing. The third component addresses the root level, the fear of exposure that makes safety performance so persistently attractive, and it draws from the graduated exposure research of Dr. Joseph Wolpe that I referenced in the nervous system conversation on this channel. Identify the task you have been performing safety around most consistently, the one that keeps not getting done while everything around it gets organized, researched, and prepared. Now reduce it to its smallest possible exposure unit. Not the complete task, the first genuine step that requires you to produce something real, something that could be seen, judged, or responded to. One paragraph of the proposal, one phone call made, one decision committed to in writing. Do only that today. Before anything else on the list, the purpose is not completion. The purpose is desensitization. Every time you approach the genuine exposure and survive it, every time the feared judgment either doesn't materialize or turns out to be survivable, the nervous system updates its threat assessment slightly downward. The task becomes slightly less activating. The pull towards safety performance weakens slightly. Not in one session, over repeated sessions of honest approach. Until the exposure that has been requiring an entire day of safety performance to avoid becomes simply the first thing you do in the morning. I want to close with something honest. I still catch myself performing safety. Not as often as I once did, but the pull is still there, particularly on the mornings when the most important work is also the most exposing. When what needs to happen will reveal something real about where I am and what I am capable of right now. On those mornings, the filing system still whispers, the email tab still beckons. The lower stakes productive work still offers itself as a perfectly reasonable place to spend the next hour. What has changed is not the absence of the pull, it is the speed with which I can now name what the pull actually is. Not productivity. Safety. And the moment I name it, the moment I say out loud or in writing, this is safety performance and I am choosing it over the real work, the spell breaks, not always immediately, but it breaks. Because the performance only works when it is invisible, when it can pass as genuine productivity without examination. Name it, and it loses most of its power. You are not someone who lacks productivity. You are someone who has been channeling genuine work capacity into the tasks that protect you from real exposure. And that capacity, redirected deliberately toward the work that actually matters, is more than enough to build everything you have been saying you want to build. The proposal is still waiting. The call is still unmade. The real work is still sitting exactly where you left it. And it is asking for less than you think, just the honest hour you have been spending on everything else. I'm Mr. Oscar. This is Execution Psychology, and I will see you in the next one.